media interest in learning about, what it's like, what it's been like for them with the demonstrations. And we also have had, as many know, just some really significant gun violence in our city. And so today we've got some guests who are going to be able to talk about both of those things. The way that we'll run this today, I will lead the three panelists through some of their experiences, and then we'll open it up at the end for questions from media. If you're on the conference line and want to ask questions, I ask that you please mute your microphones on your end, and then we'll allow you some time to unmute when it comes to that. I know there's a little delay with the live stream feed as well. So first, we're going to start out with Sergeant Brent Maxey. Sergeant Maxey, thank you so much for being here today. I know that it's been busy out there, and we appreciate you coming in. First, I want to start off, can you share a little bit about yourself, what your assignments are at the Portland Police Bureau?
Yeah, I've been a Portland police officer for just over 18 years. I got hired in 2001. I've been a sergeant for about a year and a half. My entire career, I've worked the street, I've been on patrol. Currently, I'm assigned to afternoon shift at Central Precinct, and prior to being promoted to sergeant, I spent 13 years on the rapid response team, several years as one of the less lethal operators, and several years of that as an instructor, and for a short time as the lead instructor for that program.
Awesome. So most recently, you've been assigned to Central Precinct.
Yes.
And there's been a number of nights that you've worked where there have been protests. Are there any that stand out?
Yeah, there's a couple actually that stand out. The first being, if I remember the dates correctly, June 29th into the 30th. It was a first night, if I remember correctly, that RRT was not available. They'd been working for almost a month at that point. I think actually a month at that point, and so the crowd sizes had kind of started to dwindle, and we the fences around the perimeter of the Justice Center had been taken down, and essentially our plan was to not engage the crowd. There were still small crowds that were showing up, but the idea behind that was just to kind of de-escalate the tensions and not be out and visible. We still had an officer stationed inside, right inside the front doors. The front of the precinct is boarded up, but that was just for security purposes, to lock the doors if crowds should show up. And on that particular night, they did. There were probably, I would guess, anywhere from 150 to 200 people that showed up on the 2nd Avenue side of the Justice Center. And it was he and I and then one other sergeant that were the only sworn members in the building. And that night, the crowd started kind of, they could see through small gaps in the plywood, and they were really taunting the officer inside, saying some pretty horrific things to him, talking about how they were going to burn the building down, how they were going to kill him, just some things that really nobody should be exposed to. So myself and the other sergeant, we just moved him back so he would be out of sight, in hope, again, to de-escalate the tensions and to not have this thing, blow up. But the crowd was interested in other things. They were not interested in de-escalating. They, in fact, we were watching some of the live streams. We were watching on the cameras that at the time were operational. And they were completely escalating. They were tearing pieces of plywood off to expose the windows, and as they would do that, myself and the other sergeant would move, again, to stay out of sight, but we were still there for security. And it got to the point where they were, throwing burning material into the lobby through gaps in the windows and blowing marijuana smoke, and it was almost like a scene out of a horror movie. It was really unnerving, and our thoughts were, again, to keep, trying to de-escalate by not having officers come into the area, by not, moving squads in to clear off the front of the building. We were just really hoping that they would do what they were going to do and then leave. But it wasn't until they had removed all of the plywood, they had disabled all of the exterior cameras, that they started coming at the windows with hammers. They had removed some 2x4 lumber, and they were smashing at the windows of the precinct in what I believed was a really sincere effort to get inside. And it was so unnerving to the people inside, in fact, that the civilian staff, we had to move them up to the upper floors of the Justice Center to shelter in place. And we ended up taking a defensive position, fearing the worst, that they were coming inside, and by words and actions that we had already seen, their intent was to harm us and to essentially burn down the building. So while I was on the phone making command notifications, the other sergeant that was on scene moved a squad in to clear off the front of the building. And that particular night, I think we spent probably the better part of the next 2 hours with a very small contingent of Portland police officers and Multnomah County officers defending the building. We would make pushes, because that was the only thing that we really had available. We would make pushes away from the building, and they would come back and continue to remove the board up from the north side of the building, and continue to make their attempts to start fires and to gain entry, and it just it ultimately ended up ending through their attrition. They kind of started to fade off into the distance, but for a long time they were really persistent and just absolutely refusing to leave, despite any attempts of on our part to de-escalate.
So when you talk about the officers who were out there doing the pushes, you're talking about patrol officers who've had some basic training in mobile field force and things we get at Advanced Academy, but you didn't have the specialized team from RRT.
Right.
And what about, arrests or giving direction or commands? Was any of that considered, or how did that work?
Yeah, that was difficult because, again, through RRT, there's generally an incident command. There's the emergency operations center is in place, and there are higher level ranking officers that are kind of helping control the entire event. And in this case, it fell really on the shoulders of myself and another sergeant, and then finally an acting lieutenant who made his way to the scene. And coordinating all of that, along with coordinating the people on the ground and trying to strategize on how we were going to bring this to a successful conclusion, was extremely difficult, and frankly, it was overwhelming. We were able to get a couple of officers on a PA in a patrol car behind us to make announcements. And realistically, those announcements, we essentially just tried to have them emulate what they had heard at previous events. We would tell them, let them know that the streets are closed, and that if they don't, follow our commands or get out of the streets, all of the warnings that we give. And as we know throughout these events, those announcements are not well received with a certain contingent of the crowd. And on this particular night, every single person in that crowd was, all of the people with a message had gone, and this was 200 rioters essentially is what it was. So that was very difficult to get that message across, and to try to make sure that we were doing it, through all the admonishments and everything that we're, required to give, and it was an extremely overwhelming experience.
And in the meantime, you have a precinct where calls for service are still coming in.
Yeah.
And what is that like, trying to balance, what's happening outside the precinct?
Well, first of all, given Central Precinct, or any precinct in the city for that matter, is really kind of a hub of operations where there are essential things inside those buildings that we need to successfully do our jobs. So patrol officers need to have the ability to come and go, and really throughout the last couple months, that's been extremely difficult in timing. How do we get into the precinct? It's one of those things where there might be something that is maybe time sensitive, where evidence needs to be submitted, but they can't get in, so they have to run across town and check with another precinct to see if that is available. So things like that make it very difficult when there's a crowd around, but the amount of resources available to actually deal with the calls is extremely limited. And I have seen calls throughout the last couple months that have held for, a day because there's just nobody to go. And particularly on a night where, we already have limited resources to begin with, and then we pull several officers off of the street away from patrol to deal with a crowd that essentially wants to burn down the building with, the jail and civilian staff and all kinds of civilian people in it. It just completely decimates our resources.
So I know from talking to you earlier, there was another night that really stands out.
Yeah.
I know we've had many nights. Some of them seem like they blur together, but you were sharing a little bit about another significant night. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and I can't remember the date, but we had a relatively large group. If I remember, again, it was, I think by the time I got there were 400 or 500 people, but a large group had marched up to the Portland Police Association office up on Lombard, and I was called in as part of a mobile field force. I got together a mobile field force squad from Central Precinct and took them up there, and basically our job was just to kind of augment, supplement the and reinforce the other mobile field forces that were there, along with our squad of rapid response team. And during that time, the PPA office was being boarded up, which took quite some time. And while we were standing on line for hours, our officers were subject to some of the most horrific displays of hate that I've ever seen in my life. In particular, I had 2 female officers on my squad, and the crowd seemed to really key in on them, along with the women that were on RRT. And they were just saying some of the most vile things to them, talking about sexually assaulting them, talking about how they were, sex objects for all the other officers, on the squad. And even going as far as to say that there was one individual who said that he was going to take the baton from one of the female officers and sexually abuse her with it. It was, again, something that is so vile. Nobody should be exposed to that. And in addition to all this, we, along with the board-up crew, were taking large rocks. Bottles filled with who knows what, all kinds of objects being thrown from the crowd, and this went on for hours. I kept checking in with the officers on the line and making sure that they were okay to be out there, because it does take kind of a psychological toll, to sit there and listen to this hate, for no other reason other than the fact that we're police officers. So that was one of those nights. I would say that's down in the one of the lowest worst nights of my career.
Mm. You have anything else to add?
I just really think with everything that's going on, I really think that most people are really supportive, I believe. I still truly believe that most people are really supportive of us. When we're down here during the day, when I walk out of Central Precinct or out in the community, there are people all the time that stop and say, we don't agree with what's going on. We support you. We love you. There are signs downstairs in the lobby of, where people have brought those things to us. And realistically, I understand and I know that this is just a small group that's causing all of these issues, really. But I don't believe that they have any intention of stopping. And what they're really trying to do is completely dismantle, Portland as we know it. And I think more of those people that are showing support need to step up and speak out against it. And I really think that's how we're going to get through this.
Thank you, Sergeant Maxey, for taking the time. You'll be available at the end if there are any questions.
Sure.
So next we're going to have Sergeant Derek Foxwort. Sergeant Foxwort, thank you so much for joining us. You've had a variety of assignments during your tenure with the Police Bureau. Can you give us kind of an overview of your assignments?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been with the Police Bureau now a little over 17 years, and like most officers, I started out working night shift, and I was assigned to North and Northeast Precinct. From there, I spent about 3 years, and I really developed an interest in gun violence. And so I went to start working with the gun violence response team at that time. And that interest was really fostered by seeing the significant negative impact that gun violence had on specifically the district that I had worked in North and Northeast Portland. I spent about 5 years there, and I was either on scene or paged out to literally countless of shootings in and around the city of Portland. From there, also developed an interest in training. And I think one of the things that's being discussed right now is how do you change culture, how do you change organizations, and it's through training. So for about 5 years, I was one of our lead patrol procedure instructors, had a great partner, and our focus was always on providing the best level of training that we could for our officers and always striving for excellence. From there, I was promoted to the rank of sergeant about 3 years ago, and I was assigned to Central Precinct for about 2 years, and dealt with all the livability issues that we have in and around Central Precinct, from folks that are affected by drug and alcohol addiction to folks that are affected by mental illness. And then we had our robberies and shootings and stabbings as well. And then about a year ago, I went to the human trafficking unit, where I'm currently one of the sergeants in the human trafficking unit. I've also been a member of the Special Emergency Reaction Team, or CERT for short, which is Portland's tactical team, for a little over 7 years now.
So you have done so much in your time with Portland. Would you share with us what your experience with racism has been?
Yeah, I think that's one of the...
within PPB, I should say.
Certainly.
Or while you've been assigned to PPB.
I think that's one of the big conversations right now, is the intersection of race and law enforcement. Internally, since I've been here, from my coworkers, I've experienced zero racism internally. The men and women of the Portland Police Bureau are some of the most accepting and kind people that I've ever interacted with, and some of my best friendships have been fostered within the Portland Police Bureau. It's interesting being an African-American officer, and I think this is a shared experience as I have conversations with other black officers. When you step outside of your agency, when you wear this uniform in public, especially if you're interacting with communities of color, it doesn't always go well. And there's a common experience that you're no longer black, you're blue. You're no longer one of us, you're part of the police bureau. And very quickly, I can remember several instances responding to calls where that has actually been called out. I'll give you an example. We had a shooting in East Portland. It was believed that one of our shooting victims and possibly the shooter were still inside, and it was starting to look like it was going to be a tactical team response. And so that's where on-duty CERT personnel to respond, and I was working that day and started to respond to that call. As I got on scene, I saw where the command post was at, started to head that way, and off to the left-hand side, there was a group of about maybe a dozen or so black folks that were kind of hanging out. And from that group, a comment was thrown out towards me, and it's like, hey, they sent the one token black guy. And I want to pause there for a moment to think about like what that actually means. So they didn't see, hey, here's a well-trained officer that's going to come help this dangerous situation. They didn't think that, hey, this is an officer that has dedicated his time and his energy towards bringing peace to our community. It was like, hey, the only reason he's here is to fit some artificial quota. And that was not the case. Fortunately, this wasn't the first time that I had experienced that. People often talk about the healing power of humor, and so I looked over at the crowd and I said, hey, we're hiring, and so if you want to join us, fill out an application, go to our website, and that kind of de-escalated the situation, and I got some chuckles. But that thought process is out there. I can remember another time I was working GVRT, and my partner, who was a mixed race guy, he's half black, half white, we conducted a traffic stop, and the young lady, she's African American, as we're walking up to the door, she said she stopped me because I'm black. And then when she turned and looked at me and saw that my skin tone was darker than her own, she's like, well, maybe you didn't stop me because I'm black. So there's this thing that we as a society, as a culture, really need to start kind of working through. And so those are just some experiences that I've had internally, externally as a black police officer.
So I want to shift a little bit and go back to, you mentioned that you were assigned to the training division and part of some key trainings. What is your perspective on the Portland Police Bureau's training programs?
Yes, so I spent about 5 years in our training division, really at the height of the Department of Justice settlement agreement that we had. And so there was a significant amount of changes with use of force policy, with looking at ways to implement de-escalation, looking at training and tactics. And the conversation that is out there right now of like defunding or abolishing the police is really counterproductive to having well-trained officers. If you want well-trained officers to respond to your calls of service, we have to make a vested interest in training. So our focus has always been, we have got to look for outside training, sending our instructors to develop them. We have to send officers to national conferences so they can bring those things back so that we can vet our own policies and procedures against what the national best practice. So that was our focus, and still part of the focus of the training division is how can we improve, how can we get better. I think things that get left out is we do look for community input. Currently there is a training advisory council, and that's made up of community members that from their different fields have a background in training, so we would vet that through them and have conversations about lesson plans that we're looking at or a new training module that we may be looking at implementing. And then all the lesson plans and all the training that we do for in-service and our advanced academy, that all goes to the Department of Justice and gets reviewed and signed off before we ever roll that out. So I think that's a continued commitment that we have. And the unfortunate thing is when you start looking at budget cuts, training is often one of the first things to go. And we're dealing with that right now. Right now we can't send officers or our instructor cadre to outside training. And that's not going to yield the type of change and kind of forward thinking that we really want here in the Portland Police Bureau.
And sometimes training is hard to codify as far as how impactful it is. You would never probably bring this up yourself, so I will. I know that you were pivotal in bringing what's the TCCC training, including teaching officers and sergeants throughout the bureau on first aid, because a lot of times we're there before medics. So can you talk a little bit about that, because lives have been saved, and I know I'm throwing you a curveball here.
Yes, so several years back there was a couple of us in the training division that had the opportunity to go to a tactical emergency casualty care class, or we call it TEC for short, and it's adopted from the military's form of basically field medicine. And the focus is to stop life-threatening hemorrhaging as quickly as possible. So when we went to that training, we came back, we said, we've got to push this out to all the officers, because as you mentioned, most times we're first on scene to a shooting, we're first on scene to a car crash, we're first on scene to a stabbing, and the sooner that we can stop that bleeding, the greater likelihood that that person is going to survive. So we pushed that out to the entire police bureau, has had our tech training. All of our officers carry tourniquets. We have IFACs in every single car. And I know that we have saved literally countless of people because we had that training that was provided to us. And if we hadn't gone to that outside training as instructors, there would be people that are alive today that would not be here because an officer got there first and had the training and experience to save that person's life.
And what's IFAC stand for?
Individual first aid kit.
Okay, those are in all the cars.
Correct, those are in every police car.
Awesome. So we're going to shift gears a little bit again. Can you share your perspectives on this alarming increase that we're seeing in shootings across the city? I know you mentioned that you worked formerly with what was considered get then and a lot of gun violence.
Yeah, certainly. There's no getting around. This last July was the most violent month that I think the Portland Police Bureau has had in 30 years. We had 15 homicides. We had 99 shootings, up from approximately 35 the previous July. We had 38 people shot. 24 of those people were dark-skinned like me, 24 African Americans. It is frustrating and saddening to see the level of violence in our city that we've seen over the last 60 days, and it absolutely has to stop. I think right now the national narrative and the spotlight is on the police and police reform and accountability, which we absolutely have to have. We absolutely, as law enforcement, can never be satisfied with the status quo. We always have to look how we can improve. The other side of that equation that we're not really talking about right now is how do we affect change? How do we, if 65% of our victims this last month were Black African Americans, how do we change that? As a community, there are folks out there that know who did these shootings. It's on them to start stepping up and come forward and working with law enforcement. And I think a big part of that is that we have to have the relationship building. During my time in the training division, one of the common kind of outcries from the community is we need to see you in non-crisis situations. And we just lost some great resources. Our youth services division was one of the best ways that we interacted with young people in non-crisis situations. Being at the football games, just their support, not to take any police action, but just, hey, we knew the community, we knew the kids, we could have those conversations. And without those opportunities to build relationships outside of crisis mode, I think that's going to continue to escalate the level of violence that we see. People are asking for, I want to know the officer, I want trust, I want community. And I think, again, we're going from call to call to call, protest to protest to protest. There isn't time to develop those type of relationships unless we have those type of units that have the time to develop those relationships.
You touched on how important this is, but what are your thoughts on police reform?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. First is we need to establish where does the Portland Police Bureau currently exist. I think people are asking for change, but they don't truly understand where we sit as an organization. You can go to our website and review all of our use of force policies. You can review everything that officers are required to do. And I think that's a starting point, is educating ourselves. The next question that I think we should be asking is, what are the expectations you have from police? If you are picking up the phone and calling 911 because you're being assaulted, your house is being broken into, you're being hurt, how long do you want to wait before an officer gets there? A minute? 5 minutes? Like Sergeant Maxey mentioned earlier, it was a day. And that response time is directly related to funding and the number of officers that we have available to send to you for help. The second question I think we should be asking is, how well do you want that officer trained when they respond to help you? If you want a well-trained officer, there has to be a commitment to training, which means there has to be a commitment to funding. The conversation right now around defunding and abolishing the police do not equate to those goals I think the community is really asking for, of a well-trained, efficient officer to respond. And that also goes with our investigative capacity as well. God forbid you are the victim of a crime and it has already been committed. Do you want your crime investigated, whether it's the burglary or the assault, or maybe, God forbid, your family member has been a victim of a homicide? All of those are directly related to staffing and how well funded your law enforcement agencies are. So I think those are the conversations we need to start looking at. Those are the types of things I think will get to where we want to be as a community, where you want your law enforcement agency to be.
Any final thoughts to wrap it up?
I think one of the things I want to mention is that there's been so much emotion and so much kind of verbal garbage that has been tossed out, is that at the end of the day, when police officers take off the badge and the body armor, we are part of the community. We are part of the public is part of us. We just give full-time attention to it. And so please just remember that on both sides of the badge, that we are just people at the end of the day that are really, truly dedicated to serving our community.
Thank you so much. So next we're going to have Officer Rihanna Carriage. Officer Carriage, thanks for joining us. Can you also start out and kind of share a little bit about your assignments and why you chose to work for Portland Police Bureau?
Yes. So I originally started here as a volunteer working in the missing persons unit, and then ultimately got recommended for a paid position working under the grant in the cold case homicide unit. And that ended up being kind of the pivotal experience in my life that even led me to consider becoming a police officer. had no intentions of doing it whatsoever. And now looking back, I have no regrets about it, even despite the way things are. But that got me to apply to become a Portland police officer. And during the almost 8 years that I've worked here as a police officer, I've worked on patrol, I've worked with the human trafficking unit, I worked on the gang enforcement team, and when the name changed, the gun violence reduction team. And then I've also worked and still do work part-time or detached in the training division as well, teaching new hires in the advanced academy, as well as helping out during annual in-service to sworn members that work here.
You put a lot in a short time, and we're glad that it worked out for you to join us. I've worked with you before, and I just know you to be one of the best. So we know there's been a lot of renewed interest in the gun violence reduction team, or GVRT, and you worked there for over 3 years. Why did you choose to work with this team, and what was that work actually like? I think there's a lot of misinformation out there.
Yes. So I'd say any of my interest in it started first being a patrol officer and responding to dozens, if not hundreds, of shootings during my time on patrol. I was assigned from the time I was off probation until the time I joined the gun violence reduction team to North Precinct, where at the time especially there was a lot of gun violence. A lot of it was still happening there. It's kind of spread out all over the city at this point, and especially into East Portland, but North Precinct, due to the historical ties as well, is the area for it. There's still a lot of history there. And seeing how prevalent the problem was, it was eye-opening, because you don't hear about it always on the media. You might get a couple here and there. But as a police officer and seeing how many shootings there actually were, and now looking back to the time when I was on patrol, it's nothing compared to where it is now. It's a big problem. And then also seeing and working around the officers who were on, was gang enforcement team in that time, seeing the reputation that unit had within the community, but especially in the black community, who was the most and heavily impacted by gun violence, I wanted to be a part of that. I would be, as a patrol officer, rolling up and maybe doing a traffic stop on somebody who was and happened to be African American. I might get yelled at and called a racist. You're only stopping me because I'm black. You're profiling me, XYZ. And then I would have an officer who was on the gang enforcement team who would come up and cover me and happen to be in the area, and then they would walk up, and immediately that person might have had prior contacts with them before, and as soon as they either recognize the officer or saw that patch, it immediately calmed down the situation. Any sort of comments about me being racist or profiling somebody for, stopping them for those reasons, it ended because of the relationship and the respect that they had built up over the many years before I even became part of the team. But seeing that was huge for me, because I will not put myself in a situation or participate or work for something that I can't go to sleep at night and something I don't believe in. And getting to see that was kind of what really sparked my interest in joining the team.
And what was the work like on the daily basis or weekly basis? Can you describe just kind of, even when it was really busy?
Yes, it was
not very much sleep, I can say that.
No.
So if you were on call for the week and you were working for that week, kind of describe what that's like.
Yes. Little sleep, very little sleep. It became a trend, especially when I was on call. It was not uncommon. A light night of getting called out might have been 3 page outs, anywhere from 5 to 7, staying awake for 25, 30 hours at a time because of responding to shootings. It's a sacrifice. To work in that unit, it was a sacrifice for sure. But it's a unit that you have to have a passion and a care for, and all of the people that I worked with had a true passion and care to do that work, because if you didn't, you wouldn't survive, to be honest. It's a lot of work. It's a huge time commitment. It is hard on you mentally, physically, emotionally. It is a very, as we can see, political and hot button topic to be working in that unit, which now does not exist. And it takes a lot to be able to live with that every day, but then at the same time, you recognize and I recognized the need for that unit and how important it was. And it is devastating that it is not here.
So can you describe, you talked about responding to the scene, so that's after the fact. Can you describe what it's like? What were you guys doing out there? Who were you interacting with? What was that like?
So I was assigned to the afternoon gun violence reduction team unit, and our role was a little bit different, but still part of the greater role of the entire unit, and we were the more proactive piece of fighting gun violence. We responded to shootings. That was one of the biggest things we did. You know, whether we were working at the time and on duty or responding to being called out, we would go respond to shootings. We would process crime scenes, communicate and interview the people that were there and victims of that, interview witnesses. And then also the other part of what we did was the proactive part of it, which was always information-based. That's probably one of the biggest misnomers or maybe lack of understandings of what our unit did, is we didn't just go around and stop random black people, period. Never. I would never be a part of something that did that. Everything we did was information-based and intelligence-based, and based off of the relationships that we had with either those who may have been in gangs, or from their family members, or from people who've been victimized by it, or from working with community partners and all the outreach organizations that we did. And it was with the intention of preventing another shooting.
And so it's hard. You talk about talking to witnesses and victims. It's hard to capture a lot of the emotion that happens at a scene, especially if somebody's shot, and certainly if somebody's killed. Mm-hmm. You know, those are things that are harder to describe, but it sounds like, you know, I mean, there's lots of information gathering, but the relationship piece, that is super important. So given all that and the commitment you had, you know, for over 3 years with that team, what were your thoughts and feelings about hearing that the team was being dismantled?
Insulting is kind of the first word that comes to mind, because I had to find out about that by watching a press conference. And to be emotionally invested into that unit, because it's like I said, it's a commitment to be there. You have to want to be there. It is not for everybody. It is hard. It's very hard work. And so no, I do not define myself by my job alone, but I do care, and it's the reason I'm a police officer and still am, because I care about making some fraction of a difference in the world. It does me no good to sit and complain about things that I don't agree with. I have to be some part of the solution and put myself out there and try to make a difference. And I may not ever know what that is, but I have to at least try. And so when I found out the unit was getting cut, I mean, I was devastated. It was so hard on me emotionally, because I have friendships there. We are all so close working in that unit. You know, not sleeping, staying up for 30 hours straight. There's a bond there, but also a commonality that everybody's there because they want to be there and they truly care about the work. And now the consequences of that are more than apparent.
So I want to shift gears just a little bit to talk about the protest, because that's been a really relevant piece of all this. Can you share what some of the impacts have been on you personally in the last couple of months?
I would say probably the most devastating part, like I said, was my unit getting cut. And now I am now assigned to Central Precinct, really ripped away from the precinct, North Precinct, where I truly love and have been working there for 6.5, almost 7 years, working in that precinct, working assigned districts, getting to know all of the people and the businesses and the citizens in that district, the relationships that I've built, you know, with my fellow officers, but people in the community as well. And then coming to work in an area where I don't necessarily work, and then getting to be downtown, dealing with which I don't want to call them protesters down here, but the people that are actively trying to destroy and create division, and it is very hard.
And it's been difficult in your personal life as well.
Yes, for everybody. I would say many conversations I've had with fellow coworkers who have lost friendships because of what is going on. Family members are not speaking to each other. Lines are being drawn in the sand, essentially, and people are cutting each other off, even though they know that maybe me not personally or my coworker not personally didn't do anything that is going on right now. But because of wearing this uniform and working for the police bureau and being a police officer, people are automatically assuming a lot of things about you and deciding, I don't want to hear anything you have to say, and I'm going to cut you off and not speak.
So what makes us better?
I think people need to maybe turn off their social media, stop going on long-winded tangents about what is going on, and actually talk to somebody. I think a lot of what is going on now, it's a lot of, you're hearing one side of the story, but you're not hearing the other side. And I don't mean saying you're not hearing the police side, because that's not necessarily the case, but from doing the work that I did, working in the gun violence reduction team, and then especially even in my final days there and the final shootings that I responded to before I came to Central Precinct, the voices of those this is most directly impacting, that being the African American community, they are not being heard. I think there's a segment of it being heard, but they are not being heard. And it shows that we had 100 shootings in just the month of July. And it's to just hear that number is one thing, but to truly think about that, when we had 35 shootings, I believe, at the same time last year, 15 homicides in 1 month, when our normal average for an entire year is 28 to 30. And to say those statistics is one thing, but to think about the lives behind that is also being lost. The devastation that this is having on families who are having multiple family members and friends murdered, never going to see them again. And it keeps happening and continues to happen. And they didn't have any say in what is going on. And that is one of the saddest parts of this. And just watching it and not being able to do something about it.
So any final thoughts that you want to share?
I would hope, I guess my hope in doing this and why I even participated is because I think we need to just sit down and have a true conversation. A lot of what's being said in various forms of media is, we need to have a conversation, but that's not what's happening. Conversations are not super effective when there is a whole group of people versus another person. It needs to be smaller. It needs to be maybe one-on-one. And we need to be able to listen to another perspective without interruption, without disagreeing, just listen. And then you let the other person talk and let them listen. And then you can start having a bigger conversation about what is going on. And I could say I'll open it up for myself and really any other officer here. If you truly would like to hear or talk to an officer and understand what is going on in the world, what is happening in your department, what is happening in your agency, all of us would happily have that conversation. But the time to do it is not going to be, during a protest when there's 100 of people screaming at you. You're not going to have an effective conversation. But I encourage you, if you see an officer driving around on the road, myself included, and you flag me down and say, hey, can I ask you some questions? 100% I would be happy to do that, and I know all of my coworkers would be willing to do that as well. And then the other part of it,
Just 1 second. Sorry, I thought I'd turn. Go ahead.
It's okay. The other part of it that my ask of the community, because I think this is what the community has been asking of us, is to not judge me because of the uniform that I wear. That has been the biggest issue with, I think, what is going on now, is that people see me at work in uniform and assume X, Y, Z about me. They assume they know what my values are. They think they know what my experiences in life have been, that I've lived a life of privilege, and because my skin looks white, that I have had a certain upbringing, or automatically think that I can't understand, where they're coming from and how they grow up. And probably why I purposely waited until now to say it, but it's important, is I am half black and half white. And the sad part is that I'm even having to say that, because I think we have gotten so lost in the division of police versus black, or black versus white, or white versus minority, that it is just creating more division. We're not getting anywhere. I have the three sides of the perspective. I see this as being white, I see this as being black, I see this as being a police officer, and all I see out of it is division. And there's a point where we need to just have a conversation about it.
I thank you for being so open. We're going to have about a few minutes to take some questions. So the way that we'll do this, I guess we'll just start with Officer Carriage. If anyone has questions for her, I'll turn this up and we'll just take it one at a time. And if not, if someone has a question for either the sergeants, then we can get them up here as well. So does anyone have any questions first for Officer Carriage?
I have a question.
Okay, we've got a question in the room here.
Can you talk a little bit about, since you were on GDRT, a big element of that was outreach. Can you kind of talk about now how it falls on the patrol officers, and just how difficult is it now to get that kind of outreach without that team?
So we'll repeat the question so that everyone else can hear. So the question was about, based on your experience with GBRT and the outreach that was happening, the relationship building, now that's falling to patrol. So what does that look like, or what are the impacts?
There's flat out just not enough time to do it. There's not enough time, there's not enough resources to do it, which again goes back to what Sergeant Foxwort mentioned about funding. Sadly, that is a big portion of what helps us be able to do community outreach. But right now, working patrol as well, I am so busy. I barely have time to go to the bathroom and eat during a shift. And that goes for every other officer that works right now. We are severely understaffed, which is only going to get worse. Prior to the giant budget cut, we'll have retirements coming up. We have, now with what is going on, who would want to apply to be a police officer?
And what kinds of calls are you taking regularly on patrol? Can you describe that?
Working downtown, it's a little bit different and more biased towards a lot of livability issues, a lot of camping issues, mental health issues, drug-related issues, some shootings, not as much over here compared to north and east precincts, stabbings, a lot of protest related. A lot of our resources here are just being dedicated and having to be dedicated to the protests and trying to just defend our property.
Is there anyone else on the line who has a question for Officer Carriage? Give it a second. There's a little delay with the live stream, so. Okay, is there anyone on the line who has a question for any of our panelists?
Hi, Lieutenant Jones. This is Jacqueline with Coin 6.
Hi, Jacqueline.
Hi. I was wondering if any of the officers and sergeants were involved with the recent events, either last night or the night before at East Precinct or near PPA.
I think Sergeant Maxey was here 2 nights ago, but nobody was working last night. I don't believe it would have that.
Okay.
So, okay. We can bring Sergeant Maxey up. What's your question about that? Thank you.
If they could just describe, recently we've seen things escalate on a local level, and what that experience was like being out in the field.
Yeah, again, kind of similar to the first experience I described up at the PPA office. I was in charge of a mobile field force. we went again to supplement the other mobile field force that was there along with RRT. And it was, although it was very similar to the first experience that we had at the PPA building, the one that I described earlier, the numbers were smaller, but there was more activity going on. The first night that I described earlier was more of a standoff. We were standing there as they were boarding up the building, and 2 nights ago, the building had already been boarded up, and we, again, in an effort to de-escalate, the plan from the incident commander was to kind of stay out of the area, stay out of sight as to not escalate the crowd. So there was a certain amount of tolerance for vandalism to the point where over the radio we were continuously hearing updates from Sonatrol, which has the alarm system for the building, and they could hear people breaking in, and we actually didn't move in until the crowd had gained entry to the building after lighting several fires, trying to light a fire inside. There was actually a shooting that we responded to in the midst of that event. We had to deal with the challenge of trying to keep the crowd at bay. Again, a still hostile crowd who I can only assume heard gunshots being fired, but we had to move in and try to establish some sort of a perimeter to try to find a crime scene and try to work that event while we had these, several hundred people that were hurling not only verbal threats and insults at us, but, large objects to include, the paint balloons and the rocks and bottles that we normally see. And in addition to that, there was the event where the rioters surrounded a pickup truck and started slashing tires. And my understanding of that event was through the radio transmissions and what I have since seen on different live streams was the fact that person, I don't know what happened prior, but was stopped by this group, had his tires slashed, and out of fear for his own safety, which I can only imagine, ended up speeding off through the crowd over a motorcycle, and it was in an effort to keep from being assaulted by these people who we've seen time and time again, doing exactly that. So there was a lot of dynamic events all within that event. It was very chaotic, and again, we were doing it with limited resources.
Does anybody else have any questions for Sergeant Maxey since we have him here?
I have one.
There's one in the room.
Could you talk about when is it determined that it goes from a protest to a riot? Is there any kind of criteria that has to be met? And then it's kind of a two-part question. Once it is a riot, how is it determined when tear gas is allowed to be used?
Well, I can speak a little bit to that. I mean, I'm not.
Let me repeat the question real
Yeah, I'm
quick.
sorry.
So the first part was, when is it determined when a protest becomes a riot? And I will say that is outlined in our policy, and that's online. And then the second part was when there's a determination about tear gas that can be used. And maybe you can share just from your perspective, having been with RRT for some time.
Yeah. So, and again, back to my experience with RRT, 13 years, and for a short time I was the lead instructor of that program that would be, responsible for the CS and the crowd control munitions and things like that. At this level, at the street level, those decisions are not from the street, but they're based a lot on information that is either gathered through the sergeants that are relaying information through, up on the radio, up the